filming. So this is Sean Fisher, Fisher Motorsports, talking about the GT Swarm of Beezzz. A little explanation here, Sean. Tell us.
All right, so the biggest thing is Mark wanted a car that maintained its throttle response. So turbos are great, they make excellent horsepower, the cars are fast as hell when they're turbocharged, but the issue is drivability. Just the overall fun factor of maintaining the screw throttle response is one of the biggest things that Mark wanted. So one of the problems with screws though is they make an enormous amount of heat. Fastest cars in the world use screws, some top fuel cars, blown alcohol cars for that throttle response, but they also generate a ton of heat with the screw superchargers. Turbos are far better for thermal management, and so with this project, one of our goals was to maintain the brutal torque response of a screw supercharger, but then try to mitigate as much as the thermal negative aspects of the screw superchargers. So it all starts with a big focus on thermal management, and that really starts with our airflow. So we've moved the filters to the back, we've opened up the rear fender well area so we're getting airflow through the deck lid, and the goal here is to get as much ambient air as cool as possible into the inlet of the supercharger. So this is a billet 5-axis supercharger part right here that we made. This is the inlet, and first thing you'll notice is there's no supercharger throttles. So typically on a screw you see big massive throttle bodies on them. And the problem with big massive throttle bodies is drivability. If you have a big massive throttle body and you barely crack the throttle open, you get a massive torque response. You get a car that's very jerky and difficult to drive as you put bigger and bigger throttle bodies on it for bigger and bigger superchargers. So with this, there's no throttle whatsoever. It's wide open all the time, and there's a few benefits to that. The first one is we keep ambient air flowing through the supercharger constantly. So we get a lot of cool ambient air helping keep the supercharger casing cool and the rotors cool. The other benefit of that is that a lot of screw superchargers, when they go through the lights and they close the throttles, the blowers run extremely hot and they just cut off all their cooling. The rotors continue to grow and expand, and they end up crashing into each other and ruining the center section. And you got to put a $5,000 to $7,000 center section in the blower to fix it, because it just completely locks the casing up. By not having throttles here, when we go through the lights, we're done racing or done making a pull, there's no throttles that shut here. So we just maintain a massive amount of ambient cooling going through the supercharger case. We also, if you'll notice here, we have upstream injectors. So if we do happen to notice the supercharger getting hot, which we're monitoring our case temperatures over here, we have an inlet and a discharge side case temperature, actually measuring the temperature of the material of the case. So if we see it getting hot, either one of those elevating, or if we see them differentiating by a large margin between the two, then we can turn on our upstream injection that'll actually move fuel through the scrolls and help cool those back down. Just help manage some of the heat. So next thing what we see here is if you look to the side of the motor, you'll see that there's a weld line here just above the fuel rail. So that weld line, we've utilized the stock intake manifold, but we've modified it pretty heavily. And so there's an insert that sets in here that's now taking all the air out of the supercharger and diverting the air out the back of the motor. And the benefit of this is we've now eliminated the stock intercooler, which was too small. And it was both a boost restrictor and it was just too small to handle the amount of thermal heat that we're putting into it. The other thing we've done to help manage thermal heat here is you'll notice the water neck. So there's a billet 5-axis water neck here, and there's a billet 5-axis water neck here at the back that we made. The top port on those are steam ports. The bottom ports on those actually go over to the thermostat housing. And the benefit with that is we actually bolt those with O-ring right down to the head. Then there's a 3/8 phenolic spacer that lives between those and between the intake and the cylinder head.
Hey, Sean, for those of us that don't speak car tech, what is a phenolic spacer?
So phenolic is it's basically a composite. They're anywhere from paper to linen. There's different materials that'll be in the different composite makeups of those, but for most phenolics, it's either a paper or a linen phenolic. In this case, it's a G10. So it's just got really high compressibility because we are clamping it between the intake manifold and the cylinder head, and it's just a thermal isolator. So the main reason we have it in there is to prevent heat from the cylinder head and the engine going into the intake manifold. And it's what we refer to it as our hot water bypass kit. So we have effectively cut all the water necks out of the stock intake manifold and replaced them with our billet pieces that then bypass the hot water, and the phenolic spacer then isolates the intake manifold assembly from the cylinder head. And so with that, we see if the motor is running 200 degrees Fahrenheit, we still see case temperatures in the blower of only about 100 degrees. So we see more than a 100 degree Fahrenheit differential between the cylinder head temperatures and the blower case. So it makes an enormous difference on the amount of thermal heat that's up here in the blower. So we can leave the car actually idling for 30, 45 minutes, and you can come back here and just lay your hand on the blower case, and Mark refers to it as pleasantly warm, which I think is a great way to describe it. So it really does make a big difference in how much heat gets into the supercharger from the engine. When you are running hard though, we do see pretty high elevated temperatures coming out of the supercharger. At the end of a mile run, we've seen as high as 465 degrees Fahrenheit at close to 40 pounds of boost. So because of that, that's one of the reasons we wanted to get the intercooler out. We needed a larger intercooler to be able to handle that heat. And so what we've done now is the airflow directs out the bottom of the supercharger into this billet assembly that we've inserted and welded into the intake manifold. And that basically diverts all the air out the back of the intake manifold. So then we get to a part that lives right here. It's a little hard to see. We've blacked it all out, but we call that the crossover, and it's a billet 5-axis part also that has two ports. It's got an upper port, which is the air coming out of the supercharger, and it's got a bottom port that's the air coming back in to charge the intake plenum at the bottom of the intake. So in the crossover, we take the air out of the supercharger and we convert it from a rectangular port down to a round port, and we bring it into the intercooler. So this is 2,000 horsepower intercooler cores that are made by Honeywell. They're originally designed for aviation aircraft for conditioning systems, air conditioning systems, so they're extremely efficient, they're very well made, and they are the best cores that we've found to date. So we bring the air in through here. It's actually a 2,000 horsepower core now that they're welded together. We bring the air across the intercooler core, out the intake, and it actually blows through a drive-by-wire throttle body here. So back tucked in here is a 102 millimeter billet Corvette drive-by-wire throttle body, and it blows through that throttle body back up through the crossover, and then it pressurizes the bottom of the plenum, and that's how we're actually feeding the motor. Now, you can imagine when this throttle's shut down here, idling or at the end of a run, we close that, there's a massive amount of air still coming out of the supercharger. We have to get rid of that. If we don't, obviously it would probably fail the throttle body. So that's the reason we have 4 wastegates back here, and we're actually utilizing 3 of them as blow-off valves. Pretty standard operation. They're vacuum actuated. When throttle's closed and we're under engine vacuum, they're actually open, dumping the supercharger air. When we open the throttle, they get pressurized shut and the engine makes boost, just like a conventional supercharger system. Now, the 4th gate that's on the bottom over on the passenger side, we're actually using for boost control. So the supercharger's pulleyed for 40 pounds of boost, but we can actually dump all the way down to 3 pounds. So for example, first gear, we'll modify based on the tires that we're on, the track surface, how good the conditions are, what fuel we have, what percentage of ethanol content, or if we're on straight methanol. Depending on all those factors in the gear that we're in, we can dump the boost off. So for example, first gear might have 5 pounds of boost, second gear might have 18 pounds of boost, third gear 30 pounds of boost, and 4th gear gets all 40 pounds. So we have the ability to manipulate the power level depending on the track conditions, the tire that we're on, the gear that we're in, things of that nature. It makes the car extremely drivable. And then past that, if we do have a situation where the car drives over something slick, we have a bad track condition service, we've actually added very high quality wheel speed sensors all the way around the car with custom trigger wheels on its own complete independent system going into the Motec, so we have professional level race grade traction control. With that, we're able to race grade launch control. We've also given the driver the ability, if you look inside, we've added a keypad. So inside the car, there's a keypad that we've added for driver to access, and it has all of the controls on it. So we have the ability to turn off the traction control to do things like we want to do a burnout, or if we just want to play around. We have a wheel circumference button if he changes from the street tires to his road racing slicks, or if we wanted to put drag radials on it. We have things like our nitrous control, water pumps for water pump out, and then here, because we've added drive-by-wire, the car never had cruise control. Now we have cruise control buttons.
Okay, all right.